Hey, good morning. How are we? All right. Well, Jason, thanks so much for those words. That's really kind, and it's super encouraging to hear that. It's an honor to be here, and I am humbled and grateful to be with you. Truly, I want you to know that. It's no small thing for a church to share its pulpit and to invite somebody in. And I recognize that. I serve at a church and have been there for a long, long time. And when we invite folks in, we take great care with who we invite in. And so thank you just to the church leadership here. And for y'all, I want you to know this. I love Texas, and there's nothing like West Texas. When I come out here, man, the sun sets and there's no humidity. At least it's not like it is in Dallas. And y'all are good folk. I just really appreciate the West Texas vibe. And so thanks for being a welcoming home, truly. It is good to be here. I am going to share with you a story that you're likely familiar with. It is Jesus's most famous parable. It's called, most commonly known as the parable of the prodigal son. And we're going to learn as we walk through it that there's not just one son in this story, there's two sons. And the focus of the parable is less on the sons and more on the father. And so this is a story about a compassionate father. It's also Jesus' longest parable, and it's only found in Luke chapter 15. So we'll be in Luke chapter 15. You guys are in a series. That series is on Christianity 101, and I have the distinct privilege of talking to you about this beautiful truth, that you have a Father in heaven who wants to have a relationship with you. And his heart towards you is good and gracious and compassionate. That's fantastic news. That's fantastic news if you identify as a prodigal or if you identify as the older brother in the story. And we're going to walk through that, and hopefully it'll make a little bit more sense as we do. But this sermon is a bit biographical for me. There's no question in my mind who I identify with in this story, and I identify with the prodigal son. And let me see if I can just unpack a little bit of why for you. In my middle school years, my folks divorced, and so my mom moved out. I lived with my dad and with my brother, which is a little bit unique if you think about a single-parent home. It was a little bit of a bachelor pad, and I don't say that in a good way. Just it's more descriptive of some of the realities of the home that I grew up in. And I read a quote several years ago that has haunted me in a good way. And it unsettled me with its truth. It says this: every divorce is the death of a small civilization. And I read that and I thought, man, that is my story. It's my life. And there's a lot of sadness wrapped up in that. And so that kind of set really my family, my brother and me in particular, on a trajectory. And it was a really tough trajectory. In 8th grade, I had somebody invite me to a church camp. This is my first church camp experience. I get invited. I head out there, and I'm in this dorm room of this church camp as an 8th grader, summer after my 8th grade year, and I am smoking a cigarette in the dorm room, which you can't do, right? So I get in trouble right out of the gate. I'm used to getting in trouble, and so that's nothing new for me. And then they search my stuff, and they find the vodka and the beer that I brought along with the cigarettes to church camp. So this is a little bit of a picture of where I was as an 8th grader. The church leadership had a decision to make. Do we let this kid stay, or do we send him home? And I'm grateful that they let me stay. I mean, the youth minister, his approach was, you know what, I'm hopeful that kids like this come and they have an opportunity to have their lives changed at this camp. Well, my life didn't change at camp, all right? I did get introduced to this guy that they put on me. He was my week-long chaperone, a guy named Tom. And Tom shadowed me everywhere I went. Tom was an older man. I say older. He was probably in his 40s at that time, had a couple of kids. And 40s is not an old man. At least I don't declare that to be old anymore. He was a young man in his early 40s. And so I spent this week with Tom. I get out of this church camp in 8th grade. I head into my 9th grade year. The middle of my 9th grade year, I get pulled out of school and sent to a rehab. So I just kept declining. rehab didn't take, so to speak. What happened to me in rehab is I just learned more opportunities that awaited me when I got out. And so I get out of rehab and my drugs and alcohol use continued and all the life that comes along with it. If you can think it up, it's likely that I experienced that at some level. By the time I made it to 11th grade, I got kicked out of the school district. So Plano Independent School District told me that I was no longer welcome to attend any of their schools. And so I got woken up one morning by two police officers, put in the back of a car, driven to Love Field, put on a plane, headed to Harlingen, Texas, where I got off the plane and a drill instructor was waiting for me and took me to Marine Military Academy. And that's not a place where most people there choose to go. I did not choose to go there, and neither did most of the guys that I was around. It wasn't a great experience. I go to Marine Military Academy. I was supposed to be there for a long time, and I ran away. I escaped. It's a crazy story. I don't have time for it here, but just suffice it to say, about 2 months after being there, I made a break for it and left. And then I was like on the run for weeks on end, eventually finding my way back to Plano. And I failed my 11th grade year. It's a long story. I finished school by God's grace. I didn't know the Lord at this point. And I find myself just after graduation in August, after I had graduated, at a field party. And it was a field party for another school, another group of folks from an area high school, J.J. Pierce, if you're keeping score at home. And it got rowdy and it got a little bit rough, and the vibe turned against my three friends and me, and they didn't want us to be there anymore. And the way that they shared that information is by beating the tar out of us. And so I found myself in a confrontation that started like this, and somewhere from my left, and I don't know who or with what, but the next thing I know, I am on the ground. And I eventually get up from under the scrum, and I start running back to the truck for safety as a literal mob of hyped up teenage guys are chasing me and my buddies, and my jaw is going like this. It just wasn't hooked anymore. It wasn't connected like it's supposed to be. I get in the truck and I don't drive, but a buddy drives to the hospital. I walk in the emergency room. We're all beat to a pulp, covered with blood, and I walk in and my dad is there. And he's there waiting for me. That was a memory that still stays with both of us, honestly. It wasn't a good night. I wake up the next morning, my jaw is wired shut, and it would be that way for the next 8 weeks. And what I'm about to share is a little bit graphic, but I think it points to where I was. I leaned over the hospital bed and I just vomited. Now, in all likelihood, you've had a moment where you've thrown up. It's not pretty, never is. It's worse when your mouth is wired shut. I can guarantee you that. And this is just a picture of not only really where I was, but it's sad to say this, more like who I was. I was a mess and had made a mess of it. I was frustrated and angry and lonely and just didn't know how to get out. I didn't know how to get out. And so when I read Luke chapter 15, and I read about this prodigal son, I'm like, oh my goodness, that's me. That's my story. And what Luke is doing in the Gospel of Luke, he starts off in chapters 1 and 2, and he's talking about the birth of Jesus. He shifts in chapters 3 through 9. And in 3 through 9, he starts to talk about Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is announcing this, and he's announcing his kingdom. And it's like these battle of the banquets. You've got the religious leaders who are frustrated that Jesus is hanging out with these tax collectors and sinners, guys like me. And then you've got these tax collectors and sinners who couldn't believe that Jesus is hanging out with guys like them. And it was like these battle of the banquets. He's feasting with both, trying to announce his kingdom is different. He's ushering in the kingdom of his Father. And then in chapters 9 through the end of the book, Jesus begins his march towards his mission, towards Jerusalem. And in chapter 15, he's positioned, and I want you to see what it says in the opening verses. Now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So that's the setting for what would be 3 continuous parables. Jesus looking out, recognizing tax collectors, sinners, Pharisees, everyone's here listening and wondering what the kingdom is like and what my Father's heart is like. And Jesus tells 3 parables. He first tells the parable of the lost sheep. There's 99 sheep, one goes astray, and the good shepherd goes and he finds it, and he says this, there's rejoicing in the heavens. Then he tells a parable of the lost coin. There's a woman, she has 10 coins, she loses one. She looks all around the house, turns over the furniture until she finds the one lost coin. She finds it, and there's rejoicing in the angels. And then he tells the parable of the lost son. You have a father who has 2 sons. One goes away, squanders all that he has, and eventually comes back, and there's rejoicing in the father. And what I think is really beautiful about this, and I want to commend it to you to consider it in its own right, is Jesus is saying there's rejoicing in the heavens, there's rejoicing in the angels, there's rejoicing in the Father when those who are lost are found. And Jesus is saying this is what the kingdom is like. If you want to know what the Father is like, this is his heart. It is a heart that is open and eager to receive the lost coming home. It's a beautiful heart. It's a strong heart. It's a gracious heart, a compassionate heart. And in Luke chapter 15, in the verses 11 through the end of the chapter, I want you to capture a couple of things structure-wise. You're going to see some contrasts, and I want you to look for these when we read them. You'll have a son who's lost in verse 12 and a son who's found in verse 24. You'll see extravagant waste in verse 13, extravagant celebration in verse 23, complete loss, verse 14, complete gain in verse 22. You're going to see degradation and shame in verse 15. You'll see repentance in verse 21. And you're going to see rejection in verse 16 and total acceptance in verse 20. And the son who leaves, there's going to be this cascading descent where it just seems to get worse and worse and worse. So he leaves with wealth in his pocket and some type of mission on his mind. We don't know what the catalytic event was for him to leave, but he leaves with some type of disappointment. He leaves in asking his father for an inheritance, which was early and unbecoming of a son to ask for. And eventually the son who leaves to find his own celebration, to find his own party, to find his own work, to find all of these own things, he winds up in a place of famine. And it's not just that there's a famine in the land, there's a famished heart. And so I want you to see the cascade from isolation to degradation to shame to need to desperation. And it's not that the isolation ends and the shame begins. It's that they begin to layer and compound on top of each other. And again, if I think about my own story, I can relate to this. I can relate to the feelings of being surrounded by crowds and being around people and feeling so desperately alone. So desperately frustrated with my own circumstances, my own situation, and not having language or hooks or helps to know how to rightfully deal with that. I know what it feels like to feel stuck, like I'm in a straitjacket. I can't get out. I don't know what to do. It's like I don't want to continue doing this, except I don't know how to stop. I don't know how to break the cycle. I don't know how to break the chain. I don't know what to do. Those are bad feelings. And then you're going to see that the son has a turn. When the turn happens, the son comes home, and there's a celebration that ensues, and an older brother who is entreated to come in, invited to come in, pled with, come join the party. And the parable ends not with an explicit question, but an implied one. And the implied question is this: did he? Did he come in? Like, did he lay down his frustration and entitlement? Did he lay down this sense of, well, I have earned these things you, Father, owe me? Did he lay all that down? And it just kind of hangs there. We don't know. We don't know. And it doesn't just hang there in the story, it hangs here in this gym. The question for us is, will we enter into the celebration of the Father? Will you receive his grace? And what's really beautiful is Jesus sets up this polarity from prodigal to dutiful son. And everybody in between, the invitation is the same. Will you enjoy the gracious celebration of the Father? And so with all of that, Luke 15, starting in verse 11, I'm going to read the whole parable. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that's coming to me. And he divided the property between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And then he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into the fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and nobody gave him anything. He comes to himself and he says, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I'll arise, I'm going to go to my father, I'm going to say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion. He ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe, put it on him, put a ring on his hand, shoes on his feet, bring the fattened calf, kill it, let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his older brother was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what these things meant. He said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he's received him back safe and sound. But he was angry. He refused to go in. His father came out, entreated him, but he answered his father, look, these many years I have served you, and I have never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. And he said to him, son, you're always with me. All that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and to be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. If I could give you one sentence, one hope, one invitation, it's this: return home, because God is gracious and eager to celebrate. Return home. Return home because God is gracious and he's eager to celebrate. Really, no matter where you find yourself on the spectrum, he's inviting you to join him. He wants you with him. And his heart is gracious and celebratory. Now, this may not be what is conjured in your mind when you think of Father or when you think of God the Father. But this is exactly what Jesus is saying. He's pulling back the curtain and saying, this is what the Father is like. This is his heart towards his children. Return home, because God is gracious and he's eager to celebrate. In verses 11 through 20, you're going to see that the son begins to make his way away. And then he's going to return. But he starts off with reckless living. Verse 13, he squandered his property in reckless living. Verse 14, he spends everything he had. Verse 15, he's sent into the fields to feed the pigs. Just to pause here and point this out. Here you have a Jewish man who's now working with unclean animals. Verse 16, he's longing to be fed, and nobody gave him anything. Nobody helped him. Nobody stepped in. Nobody advocated for him. And here you see this cascading descent. He leaves with cash in his pocket and hopes for something new. And what he finds is famine, not just externally, but internally. And he slides down this descent of loneliness and degradation and shame and eventual desperation. And I said this earlier, I have been there. I know what that slide is like, and my guess is some of you do as well. I mean, you know those feelings. You know those feelings of frustration or hopelessness, or maybe you don't know that feeling, but you know what it's like to watch somebody who's in it. You know what it's like to watch a brother. You know what it's like to watch a friend. You know what it's like to watch a son or a daughter. It's devastating. It's heartbreaking. And so here this guy finds himself in a place of real, genuine desperation. It didn't work out like he thought it was going to be. Life as he imagined it didn't pan out the way he had hoped. And here he is. What I think is really courageous about this guy is he eventually comes to a place of recognition. And he does hit the proverbial rock bottom. And again, I've been there. I think rock bottom for me was in that hospital bed in that August morning. That was a rough spot. I had a lot of rough patches along the way. That one stands out. And it says in verse 17, but when he came to himself, in the original languages, what this is going to point to is like this idea of repentance. He comes to himself, he sees things as they are, and he recognizes, I don't want it this way anymore. And so he says in verse 17, it says, he comes to himself, verse 18, I will arise and go to my father. Here's what's really amazing about this part of the story. This son at this point has no job, he has no purpose, he has no food, he seemingly has no hope. But you know what he has? He has someone. He has a home he can return to because he hopes that he can go back to a place that he shamed, that he potentially stained, but he's hopeful that his father will have him back home. So he gets up. And however long the journey was away, I venture to say the journey back was longer. The journey back was long. He's got no cash in his pocket. He's got no food in his stomach. All he has is a collection of regrets and a collection of stories that didn't work out the way he wanted. Can you imagine the lies he starts hearing? The narratives that start forming in his head? I got to go face my dad. I hope it goes a certain way. Okay, here's what I'm going to tell him. I'm not worthy to be your son. I am so sorry. I'm not worthy to be your son. Just treat me as a hired servant. I get it. I squandered it. I left it all. I ruined my shot. I'm not asking for anything other than to be treated like a hired hand. God, I got to face my brother. He's never done a thing wrong in his life. It's like, I don't know where he is or what he's doing, but I know he's out in the field working. Why? Because that's what he always does. He's a good guy. He gets up, he does what he's supposed to do. He does it day in and day out. I got to face that. So it's not just a long walk home. It's a long walk home over a bunch of internal obstacles and lies from the enemy that start beating down on this guy. Been there? You've been invited back into fellowship. You've been invited back home with the Lord, and all of the lies start coming your way. All of the obstacles that start getting placed before you, some of which you're constructing yourself, and you just have to keep taking a step towards home. And he does. And he eventually gets to a place where he's within view of the property. And then it says that his father saw him. So if we shift the vantage point and start to get into the world of the Father, how many nights did he wait? I mean, there's no FaceTime, there's no checking in, there's no Life 360, there's no knowing where this guy is. He leaves and he's gone. And all a father or mother can do in this instance is hope and pray. And the reality is, even with all of our technological advances today, isn't that pretty much all we got? I mean, I've got 4 kids, 17, almost 15, 12, and 10. And I can control some things, but at the end of the day, Lord, I need you to move their hearts in ways that I literally cannot move them. I can't do it. And compounded on top of that, you got this kid that left, squandered it. And a dad that is praying and hoping that he would one day return. Would you give us a reunion? Would you give me a shot to welcome him back? Part of my life story has been processing with my dad what it was like for him to wait. What it was like for him in those years. This wasn't like one tough year. This was, in some ways, 7 really, really tough years. And if I extend it out to my family, 25 hard years. Because my story is shared with siblings. He just said he dreaded phone calls. The house was quiet. It was empty. And then I'd just show up. And then I'd leave again. And he felt stuck. And he felt frustrated. I mean, these were hard years. And part of what's in my regret is looking back knowing, man, the stress I caused that guy. The pain. Not just him, but my mom. But I lived with my dad. And so it starts to happen where the father can look out and see, is that him? Is that him? And the son sees this man from afar. Is that my father? He's girded up to repeat the confession, I am not worthy to be. And the father pulls up his garment. And he, with a compassionate heart, is what the text says, runs after the son. And he embraces him. And the son says in that moment, I'm not worthy to be your son. Treat me as a hired servant. And he just interrupts him. And he squeezes him. And he holds him. And he kisses him. And he turns back to the house and he hollers, get the fattened calf. Get the robe and the sandals and the ring. My son is home. Notice what he didn't do. Notice what the father's heart is not like. He didn't kind of lean back and think, I'll be darned. The audacity. How dare he come back? Does he know the grief that he put me through? Does he have any idea what reputational harm this boy has caused our family? Not to mention all the money that he just flat out squandered. So when he makes his way up this driveway, I can't wait to lay into him. That's the aggressive dad. Then the passive aggressive dad is just, I'm just gonna kill him with distance, like he's been killing me with his distance. Just note, none of that happens. That's not the heart of the Father. I'm going to say that again. That is not the heart of the Father. He embraces him, he kisses him, and he throws a celebration. Why? Because my son was lost and he is now found. And as the barbecue flavors begin to fill the air, and the music volume gets turned up, and the dancing begins to kind of spread around the house, the older brother, he catches wind of it. Of course, he's in the back field. Why? Because that's what he does. He's a good son. And he begins to ask the question, what's going on in there? Servant says, you're not here? Your brother. Your brother's home. Your brother is home. We're celebrating. And the one who does say the I'll be darned is not the father, it's the older brother. I'll be darned. And his frustration is less with his brother and more with the heart of his father towards the brother. And there's this confrontation where he says, all my life I've followed you. And here you are throwing a celebration for this son of yours. Note that. He's like, no. Your brother, who squandered it all with prostitutes and living that kind of life. And he says, son, all that I have is yours. Will you come in? Will you join in what I'm doing? I'm celebrating that your brother was dead and is now alive. He was lost and he has been found. Will you come in? And that question hangs over you and me just like it hung over those religious leaders of that day. Will you and I come in? Here's the crazy thing about some prodigal stories is that we begin as a prodigal, and the more that we stay in and we come to faith, we can drift to be like the older brother. And so again, the bookends of the prodigal story to the entitled son. Will you come in? The prodigal enjoyed the good graces of the father, and we don't know what the older brother did. And for some of us in here, some of us may have more of that older brother ethic. I mean, I grew up in Dallas my whole life. Some have described it as the buckle of the Bible Belt. We have a ton of religious folks, a lot of good people. There's a good, strong work ethic out here in West Texas, just good. There's nothing wrong with that, unless the posture of our heart is like this older brother, where we feel like that goodness and that duty entitles us to something because of that. And what the Father is saying, all that I have is yours, and it's always and only been about grace. So would you just come in? Would you just come in? Come inside. Enjoy what's happening. Enjoy that your brother who's been lost is now found. Come inside. Enjoy the celebration. Shortly after that August morning, when I vomited over the side of the hospital bed, about 9 days later, a friend invites me to a Bible study. And I thought, well, I have nothing better to do, so I'll go. My face was swollen because of the surgery, and I looked like a mess, and I had just walked through a mess. And a guy named Tim picks me up, and we start headed to this Bible study. And on the way, Tim says to me, yeah, it's at this guy's house named Tom Bailey. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. If you remember, Tom's the guy that hung out with me in 8th grade at the church camp. And I start feeling all of this like, oh, God, I can't go in there. I look like an idiot. He's just going to have that head shake like I told you so. Kind of the, I'll be darned. And I walked in, and Tom hosted a Bible study in his house as a lay guy. for years and years for high school and college students. I walked in the back and Tom shared the gospel, and my heart came alive. And it wasn't that I hadn't heard it before. I'd heard it before. Again, I grew up in Dallas. But you know when you hear it for the first time, like when you really hear it? And I came to Tom after and I just said, hey, I don't know what all of this means, but I know that I need what you just talked about. And he shared the hope of Jesus with me. And I have never gotten over the grace of God since that night. Truly, remarkably, has changed my life. Changed the entire trajectory of my life. Changed the trajectory of my family. And I don't want you to hear this, that it was like, oh, that August night in 1996, everything changed. And it was like super easy. There was a ton of consequence to work through and walk through. But here's what's really beautiful. In Joel chapter 2, the prophet had said, if you walk away from the Lord, the locusts will come and they will ravage your land. You know what? They walked away from the Lord. You know what? Locusts came and they ravaged the land. The early verse that I hung on to when I first came to faith, and one that has been dear to me ever since, and I'm sharing this for you who are prodigals and you who may have prodigals in your life. In Joel chapter 2, verse 24, it says, when you return to the Lord, he will restore to you the years the locusts have eaten. And God is faithful to that promise. Man, I squandered so much. My family has squandered so much, and yet he has restored to us the years the locusts have eaten. Why? Because that's what he's like. This is what his heart is like. This is the invitation to you this morning. 2 Corinthians 5 says this, and this is wild. It happens every time I preach. Every time Hatch preaches, every time somebody up here shares, anytime you proclaim the gospel, did you know 2 Corinthians 5 says this, that you're acting as an ambassador, that God himself is making his appeal through you to the hearer. So right now, God is making his appeal to you through me. Not because I'm great, not because I have some crazy strength, but simply because I am a vessel that is proclaiming a truth to you about him. And that he loves you. He cares for you. No matter where you find yourself on that spectrum, he's saying to you, welcome home. There is a place for you at my table, regardless of your story, regardless of your struggles, regardless of your hangups or your hardships. There is a place. Welcome home. And the one who made a way for you is Jesus Christ himself. The one who shared this story around that table on that night. And after he shares this story, he begins to make his way to Jerusalem, to go to a cross, and to hang on a cross to absorb all of my consequence, to absorb all of the wrath that was due to me for all of the things that I actually did. And yet the ultimate consequence is not laid on me because it was laid on him. Because he didn't keep hanging on that cross. 3 days later, after he died, he rose again. And in his resurrection, he rose in victory. Victory over sin, victory over death, and victory over the enemy. And in his victory, he says this in Romans 8, now you, those of you who come to me, you share in my victory. And you become more than conquerors. So death has been defeated on your behalf. Sin has been covered through the cross. And now you have a rightful place as a son or a daughter at the banqueting table of God himself. Holy smokes. That's wild. And it's true. I'm going to pray and I'm going to ask the Lord to move in hearts as we respond in worship. Father, I do thank you. I think of the quote from Augustine where he says, "You never depart from us, O God, but yet only with difficulties do we return to you." And yet you can handle our difficulties. You can handle our stories, our screw-ups, our hang-ups, our issues. You can handle our entitlements and our self-righteousness. And so I pray for those folks in here who have just lived a life that is good. I pray that their heart would be melted by the grace that you offer them. In all their striving, there's no amount of goodness that'll ever measure up to the goodness needed. It just doesn't happen. And so for those men and women in here, I pray that you would give them an exhale. And as they receive your invitation to return home, that they can lay down their striving and their efforts and their attempts at their own righteousness or their whatever it might be, just laying it down and receiving the grace that you have for them. I pray for those in here this morning who are busted and banged up. Oh, they identify with the story that we walk through. They feel it. And I pray that you remind them that the invitation to come home is real. And that the label over their life is not that of prodigal. In Christ, the label over their life is son, daughter. And Lord, I know in here there are folks that are praying for a prodigal. They're praying for that son, that nephew, that friend, that brother, that sister, maybe even that parent, asking you to move in their hearts that they may come to themselves, that they may come home. And I pray for the brother or sister in here that has prayed that prayer so many years that they're weary of it. Would you fuel their hearts yet again this morning, reminding them that you are able. So with great confidence, would they continue in prayer? Lord, we love you. Your grace is real and it's amazing. And we celebrate you in Christ's name. Amen.